Hello, people. Today, me and Ahilleas are going to discuss a very central concept to Hegel's philosophy, perhaps his most famous concept of all, which is not really Hegel's who originated it, but he certainly evolved it further to a point where it's become uniquely identified to him. And that is none other than the concept of dialectics. So, Ahilleas, what are your thoughts on dialectics?
Yeah, I think it's a nice little topic. When
2020.
when thinking about Hegel, that's a wee topic. Uh, because I think dialectics is one of those things that is written a lot about. People, I find people, especially people who are critical of Hegel, talk a lot about dialectic, when they're sort of trying to pinpoint on what they dislike about Hegel. And I think it's a bit of a red herring sometimes when
Mhm.
people talk about it. I actually don't think it's as significant in certain ways as people think.
Okay.
Um, but you're right, Hegel has developed the concept of dialectic. When we think about it, used in someone like Plato, for example, the way Hegel thinks about dialectic is very different,
Yes.
I would say at least.
Perhaps we should
And
start with that. Like, what is Plato's use of dialectics, and then what is Kant's use of dialectics? Was it also
okay,
different from both of them, right?
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
let me take Plato and you can take Kant
Okay.
because
Sure.
I'm better with my Plato.
Of course you are.
Uh, but not very good either. So this is going to be a very cursory explanation of how I take dialectic to be functioning in Plato. I mean, in Plato, dialectic seems to be a tool, a method. Socrates, Plato's mouthpiece, will implement dialectic as a way of showing his interlocutors to have false beliefs or to have not properly thought through their arguments. And in this respect, dialectic, and then just to be more specific, in a classic, Socratic or Platonic argument, someone will say something like, I can't think of one of those stupid examples that they give. Uh, uh, justice is for the strong.
Yeah.
That's
Good
it.
one.
Whatever the strong think is what justice is. Whatever the strong decide to do is what justice is,
Yeah.
or something to that effect. Which is given to us in the Book One of the Republic.
Hmm.
And Socrates' approach to trying to deal with this thought will be to provide counter examples to it. Well, so if justice is what the strong say, then does this, and this, and that follow? And if and do we still have does the same argument hold? Um, but I think the central point for Hegel, when we're trying to compare dialectic to how Hegel understands dialectic, is for Plato, it's a tool. So it's something that the philosopher has sort of discovered and applies it to arguments to try and figure out whether they're sound or not. And uh, developing on that thought, it's something that is not part of reality.
Right. Exactly.
Reality is not dialectical.
No.
Dialectic, again, is something that is sort of thought up by people, humans, philosophers, and is applied to things.
Right. So is it correct to say that for Plato, you use dialectics to get to the truth of something, but truth in and of itself is not dialectical?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because I mean, for Hegel, that would be, for Plato, that would be nonsense. I think
Mhm.
the idea that something can be both good and the good can be both good and bad, or dialectical in that sense. For Plato, the good is the good and the bad is the bad.
Well, of course.
Yeah,
You just said
obviously.
so.
Exactly, yeah. That's a good point to conclude with, I think, on Plato.
Just
So
because,
how does yeah, go on, yeah.
yes, it's just a small thing about the dialectics in Plato. The word dialectics, doesn't it mean th through speech or via
Yeah,
speech?
yeah, right. Yeah,
So it really has that sort of a language component sort of built into the concept or the idea that
yeah,
you don't
yeah,
really get a sort of dialectic exposition without language, without talking about it, without argumentative discussion and so forth, like Socrates
yeah,
does.
yeah, definitely. So how does this differ from, or how does Kant build on or differ from Plato's notion of dialectic?
Um, yeah, so throwing back my mind on Kant, um, it seems that Kant sort of inherits this idea that dialectic is also something that's not part of the things themselves or like part of the truth of how re things really are, but it's nonetheless necessary. It's unavoidable. It's not like we ever get access to, the right concept or the thing phenomena without dialectics.
Hmm.
Seems to be part of our mental makeup or cognitive apparatus to be susceptible to dialectics.
Hmm.
So that we have these, for Kant, I think dialectics is basically like illusions, right? These things that only appear, but they don't map onto reality properly. However, because they are unavoidable, they are all like they are unavoidable, but they're also they can be corrected. So reason can be self-correcting, so it can discover its own dialectics and not fall prey to them, so that we can avoid committing ourselves to various illusions about the world and reality and obtain a better, kind of more truthful experience.
Is
So,
dialectic part of pure reason?
yes,
Is it? It's within the domain of pure reason. Okay.
yes, it's taken up in the first critique. I forget exactly which section, but it's there in the middle of the book. Um,
Okay.
so it's both
The,
like has both a kind of positive connotation
yeah.
that, well, it's unavoidable. It is part of our rationality, part of our mental makeup, but also like with Plato, it's a negative thing in the sense it's not part of reality and it's not part of the truthful concept of
Mm.
things.
Yeah. So from what you said, I just made some notes. One thing seems to be that Kant adds the concept of necessity to the concept of dialectic.
Yeah,
That its dialectic is no for Plato, you don't get at least I don't get the sense of necessity when he's talking about using dialectic to figure out whether someone's argument is sound or not. Whereas with Kant, there is dialectic is necessary to reason.
right.
It's fundamental to reason. It's part
Yeah,
of reason.
yeah,
Um, and that seems to be a step towards Hegel's conception of dialectic, in a sense.
exactly. I think so too. And with Kant, you sort of get the sense that he also gives us a reason why we have illusions or wrong ideas about things. Whereas with Plato, the best he can come up with, well, we just forgot.
Yeah,
We forgot how things work, and now we're trying to remember. That's what we're doing in philosophy. We have some ideas, idea of equality and so on, which cannot be given to us through reality. And there's a bunch of other ones. And through doing philosophy, we can remember what it's all about.
yeah,
With Kant, you don't have that problem. You don't have that contingency element. It's kind of it follows from just being rational in the way we are, having these experiences, that dialectic will pop up.
yeah, yeah. Nice, yeah. And another point that I thought struck me as interesting was the idea that for Kant, dialectics, or dialectic is an illusion, or the products of the dialectic in pure reason are illusions.
Well, I would say the dialectic is the illusion in Kant.
Is the illusion,
It is
yeah.
how something seems to be, not how.
Right. And to take some classic examples, it's that something is both finite and infinite, right? That there are arguments for the finitude of the universe and there are arguments for the infinity of the universe. And or am I thinking of another aspect of the critique?
You're thinking about the what are they called again?
The
Antinomies.
per the antinomies.
That is a step
Okay,
up. That is a different thing.
that's a step up. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I guess what I was going to say, maybe it doesn't make sense, is that just as dialectic for Kant is an illusion, so too would for Plato the conception that something can be dialectical, that could be an illusion or wrong. Um, so you can see both in both positive and negative senses how
Yeah.
Plato's conception of dialectic seems to evolve in Kant's and to develop and take on new shapes.
Yeah.
Principally, the most important shape seems to be that dialectic becomes part of pure reason, part of what it is to be a self-conscious being, rather than just something that a philosopher may or may not apply to a philosophical argument.
Yeah. So you speak, we've now moved on to Hegel, right?
I mean, essentially, now this is essentially Hegel. Yes, exactly. I mean, this is also why Kant is so important for Hegel. Because for Hegel, dialectic is obviously, I mean, Hegel takes up Kant's point that dialectic is part of pure reason. And but for Hegel, dialectic is not an illusion, and
Well,
it's not a part of pure reason or reason.
yeah. No, I
And
think, yeah, illusion would be too strong.
yeah,
At some point, it does take the shape of an illusion, shine, but not always. So dialectics takes on a broader meaning in Hegel than sort of pigeonholing it to certain things. Uh, so as you were saying, from Kant, Hegel builds on the element of necessity, that this is part of self-consciousness, is part of the rational makeup of human beings, of our experience and so on. So that's one thing. But maybe one thing that Hegel pulls out from Plato is this developmental mode of dialectics. The fact that so there is something in Plato that you get the idea or concept of something, you grasp it, you learn about it, you figure it out through this process, through this movement of going back and forth, right? Going bobbing back and forth between extremes, especially, right? So that's a kind of very sort of significant, it seems, in Hegel as well. So I think there's both things that Hegel pulls out from Plato and Kant,
yeah,
and puts his own spin on the thing.
yeah. I think that's a really important point. This thing of dialectic as development. I mean, also Hegel is obviously very aware of this because in the final chapter of the Logic and the Absolute Idea, he talks about method,
Hmm.
and without getting too much into detail, he connects the idea of dialectic with the idea of method.
Hmm.
And now I
So,
think this is just
yeah,
Hegel trying to connect himself to Plato in a sort of very theoretical way. But obviously, by method, Hegel doesn't mean what Socrates is doing, which is the external application of a tool onto a
yeah,
philosophical concept.
right,
But as you said, he does mean this sort of developmental aspect that you sort of get from dialectic. So Socrates' arguments sort of develop through the dialogue. They
right,
sort of take you through a conceptual journey.
yeah,
Um, and I think you're very right to say that's what Hegel is trying to hold on to, preserve
yeah,
from Plato's conception of dialectic, this idea of method as a developmental conceptual journey.
yeah. It's really interesting you mentioned the last, like the final bit on the logic about method, because it seems to me like by calling it a method, Hegel sort of commits himself to saying, well, this isn't just something that randomly happens. It isn't a force out there,
Mm,
a power or a thing that we just tap into, or it taps into us and sort of guides us, or is a kind of like a will out there doing a bunch of stuff, and we are just kind of expressions of it, or anything in that sort of respect. He distills it to explicit terms that can have various different degrees and determinations, And the entire logic is just that. It's the
Yeah,
dialectic in its 5,000 shades of being.
very good. Good save there. Yeah, I think that's really important. And that's sort of why I said in my opening remarks that I think dialectic can be a bit of a red herring when
Yeah.
people talk about Hegel, because,
So with that, why don't we move on to the red herring, the typical idea that people have.
yeah.
Uh, s-
Well, you start with that then, because mine is sort of a bit more, mine is like the next step after that. But what you're thinking of is, I think, a better starting point.
okay, let's do that one then. Let's see here if I can
Yeah.
share the screen. Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, second. Right. So typically we have the is this good? Like, can you see it clearly? So
Yes, I can. Yeah.
remember that some people might be watching on a smaller screen, like mobile. So the dreaded
Hmm.
thesis, antithesis, and synthesis.
The foundation of all essay writing in British secondary schools.
Yeah. Whenever somebody talks about Hegel, even and academic people, people who are philosophers, I think ought to know better. They think that this is Hegel. This is what Hegel is about, right? And it's not. Hegel did not subscribe to this, and nowhere does he use it like formulaically as this. Um, it comes from Fichte, but I want us to sort of explore why it's not part of Hegel a little bit.
Yeah.
So, if we were like to think a little bit Hegelian about this, the thesis is somehow connected to the antithesis. Okay, right?
Hmm.
But the antithesis isn't just something that's the other of the thesis, the not of the thesis. It's also a thesis on its own, right? So you have to sort of commit or grant that this is also a thesis. Well, if
Yeah.
that's a thesis, then the relationship this has to that has to be an antithesis,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So you're already sort of like having trouble with this representation because, well, how did these two things relate? Because this now has to have a sort of an internal relation with itself in which it is two ways, right?
Hmm. Yeah. Of course. Because that is both antithesis to the first thesis and thesis to a newly discovered antithesis.
Yeah. And
And the same goes for that one, yes.
so this kind of has to like already relate to itself in a particular way,
Hmm.
just as these two relate in a particular way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in another way, the way these two relate between themselves is the way this one relates also. Kind of like the movement appears to be the same between the thesis and the red one and the blue one, and internally within the red one and internally within the blue one.
Hmm.
Were you going to say something?
I mean, yeah, it appears to be the same, but obviously it's also not the same because uh, you know, that antithesis is the antithesis of that thesis,
Hmm.
and the thesis in the red box that relates to the antithesis in the red box is not the same thesis as the thesis in the blue box. Uh, and so really, you're not really doing justice to each of these concepts and their relations by just referring to them as the same terms.
Yes. And also, if we're granted this is, you know, the red one is internally its own thing, then there is already a synthesis there, right?
Yep. Yep.
There's
Each one
already
of those little boxes is a
synthesis in
synthesis.
there, and there is synthesis in here.
Yeah.
And what's to stop there from being a synthesis between these two,
hmm mm
right? And we can keep on going. There is a kind of infinite regression with this thought. Um,
Yeah.
but what I want to point out here is something that never ever gets answered in this way of thinking about things, and that is why is there an antithesis to begin with? Why does this occur? You know, the first difference, the first diremption, the first negation. And I think that's a big reason why Hegel doesn't think that way, and why like his idea of dialectics, the way he presents it in his philosophy, avoids that pitfall. Because what he goes on to show, I think, is exactly why this first red arrow occurs, but without this sort of baggage of this formulaic way of looking at things.
Yeah. That's really good. If I could add a separate criticism, one that is it's less sort of an imminent critique of these things as you've done so well. And it's more of just a critique based on having read Hegel. And it's that if you read Hegel, you will see that things don't develop like this. There isn't this formulaic, even if you wanted to grant thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and it didn't fall foul to this sort of imminent critique, categories do not develop in this way. Uh, things are not just, you know, positive and negative. There are uh, the development involves the making explicit of components of concepts uh, in various ways, and that development is not always simply the negation of the thing before it, or the opposite of the thing before it. It's something different to it, of course,
Mhm.
yes. But the relationship to it is not just simply that of of opposite. It is it depends from development to development, but it will be something uh, that is made explicit from what we were thinking about originally. This all sounds very abstract now. I understand, but this is why you should just do Hegel. Um, the main point is, if you do
Yeah.
Hegel, you will see that this is not how categories develop, and that they're much more complex than this sort of formulaic structure.
Yeah. We need to provide people a ladder, Ahilleas.
Yes,
Hegel does that in his phenomenology of spirit, you know. He just dumps 600 words to help people out.
yeah,
The
a slightly
densest
longer
prose
ladder to
ever
Plato's
written.
ladder. Sorry.
Um, I was saying in the densest prose ever written.
Yeah.
No, you're right. This isn't how categories proceed. So there's something in this formulaic version that is true, right? There is some like appearances in Hegel's developmental philosophy where you have a thesis and then something else pops out and it looks like a antithesis or a negation of the first one. And in many respects, that is true. But Hegel shows you how that negation occurs. And he shows it in a way such that this negation must occur from within the thesis, not outside of it. The antithesis isn't just there, placed onto it. Like capitalism isn't just the antithesis of the medieval world or what have you, right? The capitalistic world emerged out of the medieval world. So there were negations already within the medieval world that propelled it towards another historical, development and situation. And Hegel is just really good at spotting these internal negations in the thing. And I think that's what Hegel's dialectics really is internal negation, the internal negation of something. That gives you a reason why there is a movement, why there is something that might look like a thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and how the development gets going.
Yeah. One more point that I would like to make is Hegel's, if you take, we like to think of the development of the science of logic as a naive development in the sense that we don't know where it's going to go. Hegel didn't know where it was going to go, and the development is the genuine thinking through and working through of thought. Now, even if you're skeptical about Hegel's approach, uh, the approach that we take is this approach, nevertheless. We approach the science of logic uh, naively in the sense that we are surprised, perplexed, intrigued, and sometimes we expect it. And it is this aspect of it that I think strongly goes against this idea of this kind of formula, this applied formula, this idea that Hegel has a pre-existing form, a method that he then applies to thought is something that we strongly resist, and it goes against a tenet of Hegel's philosophy, which is freedom, which is
Mhm.
something that many people have discussed, most importantly, Philip in his thesis. And it's the openness to thought and what thought may develop into, which really sets Hegel apart. And thinking that Hegel's philosophy is just the application of a formula just completely ignores that and just doesn't do justice to the richness of the Hegelian program. Um, yeah,
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't do justice to the richness. That's the problem with this formula because it sort of obscures a bunch of things. It gets us on the wrong track. It has some truth to it, but what the price we pay is too high. We lose out on too much richness. Hegel's thinking and philosophy is a lot more exciting and cooler and interesting than that.
yeah. And it's in that sense that I think talking about dialectic is a bit of a red herring.
Yeah.
We could do without that word at all, and the development of Hegel's philosophy would be as rich, as interesting,
Yeah.
and as intriguing as it was when we were using that word. You know, dialectic in many ways is just a placeholder for the description of, you know, how reality turns out to be according to Hegel's philosophy. But it's such an abstract placeholder that it doesn't really tell us anything remotely interesting.
Hmm.
And talking about it in any detail is sort of irrelevant.
Well, I would like to say that we should redeem the Hegel's conception of dialectics as best as we can. I think the term, like as you say, we don't need it to get on our business with thinking the logic and the philosophy and so on. We can develop concepts without referring to it, but nonetheless, it has a richness and historical depth
Mm.
that I think Hegel was wise to tap into, and that we continue to be wise to reawaken.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very good. Well,
All right,
I hope you found our little discussion, our wee discussion
we
on
discussed.
on dialectic intriguing and fruit for more thought.
Yeah,
And please leave any comments in the comments bar below. We'd love to hear what your impression is of Hegel's, like how Hegel writes about dialectic or how he uses dialectic, and whether you think it's more relevant than some of us think it is.
yeah. Let us know if this has been helpful to you and
Mm.
if we've made any progress in getting you on the right track. Right then. Cheers. Bye bye.
Stop it, Philip. We keep sounding like missionaries. We have to we have to dial it back.